Most people are probably at least vaguely familiar with the Romanovs, Russia's ruling house and the family of the last Tsar Nicholas II. The Tsar, his wife and children were murdered by Bolsheviks in the early hours of the 17th of July 1918 as part of the Russian Revolution. The Bolshevik Party eventually became the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. If you are only familiar with one member of the family, it is probably the Tsar's youngest daughter, who has become one of the most mythologized and fictionalized figures of the 20th century. She has been the subject of numerous films inspired by the legend that she survived the murder. I'm going to spoil it right now by telling you that she didn't.
However, today we are going to explore how this myth developed over time. We are going to unravel fact from fiction through a detailed look at both the films and the real history that inspired them, so that we can ultimately understand how we got here and how the story of a murdered family became a fairy tale. So let me take you on a journey from Russia to Hollywood, with tales of royalty, curses, stolen identity, murder, and the movies. When it comes to the name, I will be using the Eastern pronunciation Anastasia when I talk about the real person and when I talk about films that use this pronunciation. I will use the Western pronunciation Anastasia when I talk about films that use this pronunciation. Most of the analysis in this video will be of the films, but it will be more historical analysis than film criticism because films are part of history and history is the field that I personally specialize in. The family members. The immediate royal family consisted of the Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, the Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna, originally Princess Alex of Hessen by Rhine. As far as I can tell, her name wasn't originally Alexandra, it was just Alex with an I. They also had 5 children.
Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei. The pronunciation in this is really hard. Anastasia is by far the most famous of the children and known for being the wild one. She was known to have tried smoking, which some people claim her parents didn't know about, but I find that kind of hard to believe given this picture, and was apparently funny and good at acting, although potentially nasty at times. Her name has a meaning along the lines of resurrection, breaker of chains, or as you can hear in the 1997 film, she will rise again. This meaning is something that gets brought up a lot as though it's a prophecy that she will come back from the dead, so it gets included as a reason to believe that she survived the murder of the royal family.
Alexei was a much longed for male heir, however, he had hemophilia B, a genetic condition wherein the body cannot produce a sufficient amount of clotting factor 9. This clotting factor allows the blood to clot when you get an injury, so hemophiliacs who can't produce enough of it are prone to excessive bleeding. It's caused by a gene on the X chromosome and it's recessive, so in its active form, it is almost exclusively seen in males and can only be passed down to them by their mothers being carriers. However, some female carriers of the disease can present symptoms and bleed more than usual. I suppose it's also hypothetically possible for a female to have it in its active form if she has a father with hemophilia and a mother who is a carrier and somehow inherits 2 copies of that gene.
Several of Queen Victoria's descendants had hemophilia, and Alexei was among them. These days, you can get professional cyclists with hemophilia because it can be managed with clotting factor from other sources. However, when Alexei was alive,
It was extremely dangerous, and even a slight injury could have caused him to bleed to death. His physical exertion had to be limited, and when he did experience bleeding, the main treatment was to simply lie him down and pray that the bleeding stopped before it could become fatal. Blood transfusions were also an option, but there's only so much good that can do when you can't stop the bleeding. A lot of the time, he was carried around by a sailor to prevent injury. Clothes Make the Woman, 1928. This silent film was the first made on the subject of Anastasia. It was released in 1928, just before the 10th anniversary of the murder, and starred Eve Southern as Anastasia and Walter Pidgeon as a man named Victor. Like almost all of its successors, this film is based on the most famous of the Anastasia imposters, who went by the name of Anna Anderson. This name will be coming up a lot, and I will get to the truth of her story very soon. But for now, what you need to know is that she claimed to be Anastasia. Some people believed her and others didn't. However, she has been categorically proven not to have been the real Anastasia. The film was lost for decades, but eventually rediscovered. I was really excited to watch this one because I love silent films. Unfortunately, when I searched for it, I discovered that it hasn't been made publicly available. Copies are held in 2 locations, one of which is in London. The plot is essentially that a man named Victor helps Anastasia escape the murder and they part ways. Victor becomes a Hollywood producer and actor, and Anastasia turns up in Hollywood while they're casting a film about her. The real Anastasia gets the role with Victor acting alongside her. Obviously, they fall in love, and apparently at some point he accidentally shoots her? The idea of Anastasia becoming an actress is something that was reportedly suggested to her because she was good at doing funny little performances for her family and friends, and was apparently quite good at entertaining people. That's the only vague similarity this has to the life of the real Anastasia, other than the murders. I would like to be able to tell you more, specifically whether or not it's any good, but unfortunately no one seems to think it's worth releasing. Anastasia, 1956. The next film came in 1956. It was based on a 1953 play by Guy Bolton and Marcel Moret, and starred Ingrid Bergman in the lead role. Bergman actually won the Best Actress Oscar for this role. She definitely acts with a capital A in this film. The film itself might not be an obvious choice for the Oscars, but this is definitely the kind of performance that the Academy laps up. In my opinion, which is always objective truth, this is the most emotionally damaged interpretation of Anastasia on film. Even though she might not actually be Anastasia. You heard me. This film begins with Bergman's character contemplating leaping from a bridge in Germany. She's pulled back by Yul Brynner, and from here on in, the plot will sound very familiar to anyone who has seen Don Bluth's animated Anastasia. Brynner's character Sergei, who is essentially Dmitri for fans of the other film, has been following her because during a stay in a mental hospital, she told someone that she was Anastasia. He takes her to meet a couple of Vlad characters named Boris and Pyotr. Bergman's character then panics when they take her down to a cellar because she thinks they're going to murder her there. Then, in what is probably the dumbest part of the film, they just so happen to have Anastasia's exact body measurements and silhouette. Then when Bergman stands in front of it, they say that it matches perfectly, even though it clearly doesn't. Then they show her some photographs of the Romanovs and tell her that they believe she is Anastasia. A large fortune belonging to the imperial family is held in the Bank of England, so these men intend to use Bergman's character to claim the money whether she's the real Anastasia or not. They take her to Paris or maybe Copenhagen under the name Anna Anderson. Yes, this one is also loosely based on her. In Paris, they introduce her to people who knew Anastasia in an attempt to get her officially recognized. Some of them believe and some do not. As I said, this was the case with the real Anna Anderson. She also says things that she shouldn't be able to know unless she is Anastasia. The main person they have to convince of Anna's identity is her grandmother, the Dowager Empress, the mother of Nicholas II. While they attempt to convince the Dowager Empress, Anna meets Prince Paul, to whom Anastasia was engaged as a child. Anna gets drunk at one point while on a date with Paul, and we just generally get to see her living in high society for a bit. The Dowager Empress is very skeptical about Anna, and they all go to a ballet in the hope of arranging a meeting afterwards. The Dowager Empress initially rejects Anna, believing her to be an actress. Then Anna begins to cough as she does in moments of fear and panic. The Dowager Empress turns back and says that Anastasia used to cough like that when she was afraid. Personally, I don't think this is a good method of convincing the Dowager Empress, but this is what the writers went for. So she accepts Anna as her granddaughter. The film ends at a ball, where Anna wears a Russian court dress with colors and design that are extremely similar to the Don Bluth film. The Dowager Empress is set to reveal Anna to the world and to announce Anna's engagement to Prince Paul. Before the ball, a group of reporters are allowed to interview Anna, and one of the men claims to know her. He claims that she was injured on a bus and that this is how she lost her memory and received the scars that she believes came from the murder attempt. This causes Anna to doubt whether she really is Anastasia. Sergei tells her that while Paul is only interested in her because he believes she is Anastasia, He would love her no matter who she is. So Anna and Sergei elope, and the Dowager Empress goes down to the ball to tell everyone,
"The play is over. Go home."
I don't know whether that line was taken from the play, but I suspect it was. This film is the only one, other than some of the TV movies, where the question of whether or not the main character really is Anastasia remains ambiguous. Every other major film makes it clear that she is the real deal. This film is really more about Anna Anderson than Anastasia. Anna Anderson. However, the 1956 film is only loosely based on what really happened to Anderson. The real Anderson first appeared in Berlin in 1920 when she attempted to end her own life and was admitted to a mental hospital.
A number of historians have linked this to something called Bendlerstrasse Bridge, which I couldn't initially find. However, others refer to it as simply Bendler Bridge, which led me to something called Bendler Brook, which is a direct translation and links directly onto Bendlerstrasse. It's also on the right canal, so I feel confident in saying that this is the right bridge. However, it was actually bombed during the Second World War and rebuilt in the 1950s, so the one that currently stands is not the one that Anna Anderson would have been on.
The film is relatively accurate with regard to this part of Anderson's life, as she did jump from Bendlerstrasse Bridge in Berlin. However, this was before her stay in the mental hospital rather than after. Anderson's accent sounded Russian to the hospital staff, although she did speak German. She also had scars scattered all over her body. Another patient,
Clara Poeta,
suggested that Anderson bore a resemblance to Tatiana Nikolaevna, the second daughter of Nicholas II,
and Anastasia's sister.
I would just like to say that although Anderson was not a Romanov at all, I do think she looks more like Tatiana than Anastasia, so I kind of see where Clara was coming from. In 1922, Poithert told a Russian emigre, that is, a Russian royalist, also known as a White Russian, who left Russia after the revolution, that Tatiana was in the hospital and several other Russians went to visit her. One, Baroness Sophie
Buxtehude,
stated that Anderson was, quote, too short for Tatiana. Anderson was later quoted as saying while still at the hospital, quote, I never said I was Tatiana. And she eventually began to identify herself as Anastasia, who was the shortest of the Grand Duchesses by a noticeable margin. Initially calling herself Anna Tchaikovsky, Anderson lived with a series of different households, including other Russian emigres, after leaving the hospital. Just as the film suggests, some believed that she was Anastasia, while others did not, including Anastasia's aunt, Princess Irene of Hessen by Rhine, the Tsarina's sister. Some were willing to dismiss her lack of memory of events and her apparent refusal to speak Russian as a product of her traumatic experiences and fragile state. She didn't appear to have full amnesia like in the films, but she did claim to have partial amnesia. She also received a lot of financial support from Prince Valdemar of Denmark, who was Anastasia's great uncle. He wanted to seriously investigate her claims, but eventually he did cut off his support. In 1927, Ernest Louis, Grand Duke of Hesse, the Tsarina's brother, hired a private investigator named Martin Knopf to investigate. Knopf concluded that Anderson was a Polish woman named
Franziska Szankowska,
who had sustained her injuries while working in a munitions factory during the First World War. Felix Szankowski, Franziska's brother, went to meet Anderson, and the reports are somewhat unclear as to whether he identified her as his sister or not. He did claim in writing that there was a strong resemblance between the two, but he ultimately left without Anderson, and she claimed not to recognize him. In July 1928, the Tsar's assets held in locations outside of the Soviet Union became available to claim, and attempts were made to obtain them for Anderson. A company named the Grandonor Corporation was set up to accomplish this, so named because it stands for Grand Duchess Anastasia of Russia. The film partially covers this by making Sergei, Boris, and Pyotr's primary goal accessing the Tsar's fortune in the Bank of England. There were rumors that the Tsar had a very large amount of money in the Bank of England, but these were probably untrue as they have never been proven, and only some money held in Germany was ever given to his relatives. None of this money went to Anderson. I did not contact the Bank of England for comment. Also in 1928, during this process, Anderson moved to the US. Despite what the film shows, Anderson never met the Dowager Empress Marie and was never recognized as Anastasia by her. Marie actually died in 1928. Anderson's mental health declined on several occasions, and she returned to Germany for a time. She had a legal dispute over the money that had been given to relatives of the Tsar. In 1938, she met Franziska Shanskowska's sister, Gertrude, who claimed that Anderson was Franziska. At one point, she even became a cat lady, and I mean she had a lot of cats. In 1968, she returned to the US and married John, known as Jack, Manahan. In 1979, she had some of her intestine and a tumor removed. I understand that this sounds completely gross and irrelevant, but believe me, it's important. She died on the 12th of February 1984 and was cremated. Anderson is the only Anastasia imposter that I'm going to go into this detail for. There were others, but she is the one who has had by far the most impact on the films and the surrounding mythology. That piece of intestine was important because it had been stored and was eventually used to extract mitochondrial DNA, which proved that she was not Anastasia. In 1953, when the play was written, and in 1956, when the film was made, Anderson still hadn't been entirely dismissed. At that stage, it wasn't completely out of the question that she might have been Anastasia, but there was a decent amount of evidence to suggest that she was Franziska Shanskowska. This is probably why the film begins by saying that only the real Anastasia, if she's still alive, knows the truth. It gives some plausible deniability. I don't want to judge Anna Anderson too harshly because I actually feel a lot of sympathy for her. She had a lot of quite severe mental health issues, and I suspect that she probably at least partially believed some of what she was claiming. Another of the film's fabrications is Prince Paul. He is entirely fictional, and Anastasia was never engaged. As far as I can tell, none of the Romanov siblings were. He's really just there to provide a love triangle and to create more of a barrier between Anna and Sergei.
I also just really hate the monocle. It makes him look like a national socialist. Plus, monocles just look really, really dumb.
I know you're not meant to like Paul, but in general, I prefer the story without him. I'm not going to be too harsh on the casting because neither the real Anastasia nor Anna Anderson could play the role in the film. They had to cast someone. However, Ingrid Bergman was known for being very tall, and Anastasia was quite short. Her exact height isn't known, but she was definitely the shortest of the sisters. Some accounts say that she was strawberry blonde, others say that she was mousy brown. However, based on the photographs we do have, even though they aren't in color, it's very clear that she didn't have the bright blonde hair that Bergman had, except perhaps when she was a very young child. Anastasia in 1997. This is probably the best known of the Anastasia films, and it is very clearly based on the 1956 version. In fact, it's essentially an animated remake because both films were made by 20th Century Fox. Since Disney now owns Fox, I think we can expect a live-action remake of the animated film at some point in the future. The film was directed by Don Bluth, and it's one of those films where they cast well-known live-action actors rather than voice actors. But I personally think they all did a really good job. Years ago, Lindsay Ellis said in her review that Meg Ryan was completely miscast as Anastasia and her voice doesn't work for this teenage girl, but I completely disagree. I think Meg Ryan is really good in this. She gives a playful, kind of spunky performance, which I think works really well for a character who's supposed to be very spirited. I think this suits what we know about the real Anastasia's personality, and I'm glad they didn't just give her a classic Disney princess voice as much as I do like the classic Disney princess films. I think Meg Ryan was a really good choice, and I am never wrong. We get John Cusack as Dmitri, Kelsey Grammer as Vlad, Christopher Lloyd, who is in all of my favorite films for some reason, as Rasputin,
Hank Azaria
as Bartok the Bat, and my absolute favorite actress, Angela Lansbury, as the Dowager Empress. I am so glad that Angela Lansbury is in this. She is the perfect Dowager Empress. She is so good at bringing warmth to the character while also making her very firm and clearly very strong. The film brings magic into the story. I think that a large part of the reason for this is that it intended to compete with and be in the style of Disney's animated classics. However, there is another reason for the inclusion of magic that I will cover when I look into how the film uses real history. This is probably going to be the longest section of the video because this is the film that I'm most interested in analyzing. It's my favorite, what can I say? The story begins with a prologue about the Russian Revolution narrated by Angela Lansbury as the Dowager Empress. It's 1916 and the Romanovs are having a party to celebrate their 300th anniversary of ruling Russia. This is incorrect, by the way. It's not the most incorrect thing in the film, but the first Romanov Tsar, Michael, came to power in 1613. Rasputin, the Tsar's former confidant turned enemy, crashes the party and, having sold his soul, curses the family to die within a fortnight. This seems to bring on the Russian Revolution, and the family try to escape the Winter Palace. Anastasia goes back for a music box that her grandmother gave her, which can be opened by her necklace. Then she and the Dowager Empress escape through a secret passage with the help of a boy who works in the palace. Rasputin falls through the ice on a frozen river and drowns. Anastasia and the Dowager try to escape by train, but Anastasia falls and hits her head. The Dowager Empress implies that everyone else died, and tells us that she never saw Anastasia again. Then the music saws, and we see St. Petersburg in the 1920s. The music is really good in this film. It is the first musical version, and Lynn Ahrens and Stephen Flaherty do such a good job of capturing this mysterious, melancholy beauty. At one point, the main character describes the Winter Palace as like a memory from a dream, and that is how the music feels. It's haunting, and I think it helps that I've been watching this film since I was extremely young because it makes it incredibly familiar, yet somehow unknown. It also manages to sound quite Russian in places, and every song is really good. There are no weak links. The music also beautifully complements the visuals. The animation in this film is so wonderful to look at. I know that it's faced some criticism for rotoscoping and reusing some pieces of animation several times over, but to be perfectly honest, I don't notice that when I'm watching the film. What I do notice is the characters in the background often don't move, and that can sometimes be really obvious. But given how pretty everything is, I forgive it. I love the look of the falling snow during Journey to the Past. I think it looks absolutely magical. The use of shadow and the warm amber glow of the palace and the sunset on the ship, it makes Russia look so beautiful, and it makes me wish I could see St. Petersburg for myself because there is such a magic to it. Then Paris also looks wonderful. The entirety of Paris Holds the Key to Your Heart is visually stunning. It even has a segment that looks like an impressionist painting. The entire film is so atmospheric, and I just love it. Anyway, our main character Anya, who is Anastasia grown up and without her memory, leaves an orphanage, and because her necklace says Together in Paris, she decides to go to St. Petersburg in order to catch a train to Paris. Someone tells her that a man named Dmitri can get her to Paris, so she goes to find him at the palace. Dmitri and his friend Vlad are con men who have been looking for someone to play Anastasia, so they can claim the reward the Dowager Empress is offering for her return. Recognizing Anya's resemblance to Anastasia, they suggest that she might be her, and take her to Paris by train. The mention of Anastasia being alive wakes Rasputin, who has been held in limbo because his curse is unfulfilled. So he vows to kill her, and his bat Bartok is just kind of along for the ride. Rasputin tries to kill Anya in a train crash as she leaves Russia, but the gang work together to survive. Dmitri and Vlad coach Anya on Anastasia's life and family, and they all get on a ship where Rasputin tries to kill Anya by making her sleepwalk into the water during a storm. This time, Dmitri saves her. When they arrive in Paris, they meet the Dowager Empress's cousin, Sophie, who asks Anya questions, including how she escaped. Anya says that a boy opened a wall, and Dmitri realizes that she is the real Anastasia because he was the boy. Sophie says the Dowager won't see any more potential Anastasias, but agrees to arrange a meeting after a ballet. Ringing any bells? This time the ballet is Cinderella. When the ballet finishes, Dmitri tries to talk to the Dowager Empress, but she has heard of him auditioning Anastasia lookalikes. Anya overhears and gets very angry at Dmitri for lying. Dmitri steals the Dowager Empress's car, drives her to where Anya is staying, and insists that she give her a chance. The Dowager Empress initially thinks Anya is acting, but then Anya smells her perfume and says she remembers spilling a bottle of the perfume on a rug. She plays with her necklace, and the Dowager Empress notices this and shows Anya the music box. Anya finally remembers how to open it and hums the tune it plays. This convinces the Dowager Empress. Dmitri refuses the reward money, and the Dowager Empress throws a party to reveal Anastasia to the world. Before Anya steps out, the Dowager tells her that Dmitri didn't take the money, and Anya leaves. Outside, Anya meets Rasputin face to face, and he tries to kill her. Dmitri comes to help, and eventually Anya kills Rasputin by breaking the reliquary he sold his soul for. Then Anya and Dmitri elope and sail away down the Seine. Also, Bartok gets a girlfriend. The end. So it is extremely similar to the 1956 film in most of its non-magical elements, but it is a lot better and the romance is far more convincing. By the time this version came out, DNA evidence had proven that Anna Anderson was not Anastasia, so it eliminates most of the specifics of her story, such as her time in Berlin, and only keeps in the need to convince someone of her identity. The money in the Bank of England, which was based on a real rumor, has also been replaced with reward money. The most obvious separation, which makes it clear that this version is not intended to be a dramatization of Anna Anderson's life, is that it does not use her name. Anya is clearly a similar name, which can also be a diminutive of Anastasia, but it gets rid of some of the baggage that the 1956 film has to carry. Paul is also gone, thank goodness. In this film, we get to see some Anastasia imposters, which is a nice nod to the fact that there were so many Anastasias roaming around the world claiming to be princesses. Anna Anderson was one of many. The film also ages Anastasia down to 8 years old at the time of the revolution. She was actually born in 1901. Instead of having the family sent to Siberia and then to Ekaterinburg, with the execution taking place in 1918, it seems to happen in 1916, and Anastasia escapes with her grandmother. Marie wasn't actually in Russia during the revolution, so this definitely didn't happen. Similarly, the film shows the family
fleeing the Catherine Palace
and never reveals how they actually died. Again, it is difficult to say what her hair color really was. The film gives her a very stylized shade of red, almost auburn hair. As I said earlier, some accounts suggest that her hair was strawberry blonde, so it may have been reddish, but it probably wasn't as red as this, otherwise I think people would have said. The really interesting part of this film is the historical basis for its use of magic. So the villain of this film is Grigory Rasputin, based on a real person, who was believed by some people to have magic powers. Rasputin was a very strange man. He dressed like a monk, as he does in this film, but he wasn't a real monk. He was a horse thief when he was young, and he was extremely promiscuous. Most of you will probably have heard the Boney M song where they call him the lover of the Russian queen. Well, there were a lot of rumors surrounding the relationship between Rasputin and the imperial family. The most repeated is that he was having an affair with the Tsarina Alexandra. I cannot say for certain what is or isn't true here, however, I can say that a lot of people really did not like the apparent influence Rasputin had over the Tsar, and this was a contributing factor behind the spread of such rumors. Political cartoons from the time show the Tsar and Tsarina as children sitting on Rasputin's lap, as though he's in charge of them and subsequently of Russia. It is also a way of demeaning the Tsar and making him appear weak. However, Rasputin was definitely very close to the royal family, and they described him as their friend. The belief that Rasputin had supernatural abilities stemmed from an occasion on which he accurately identified a horse thief after hearing from his sickbed that the crime had taken place. He was able to calm the people he sought to heal, and his eyes were considered by many to be hypnotic. I kind of have to agree with this, even based solely on photographs, because when I saw a photograph of him, I thought I was going to have a heart attack. His eyes were unusual, even a bit scary. I can insert photographs of him in here as jump scares. Anyway, the Tsar and Tsarina first met Rasputin in 1905.
They believed that he was able to improve the condition of Alexei during periods of severe bleeding caused by his hemophilia.
There may even have been some slight validity to these claims, as calming can help to reduce blood pressure and subsequently enable blood, which has accumulated at the site of an injury, to spread out. So if Rasputin's hypnotic eyes were able to calm Alexei down, they might actually have helped him.
The 1997 film takes these rumors of Rasputin's magical abilities and turns them into fully fledged magical powers.
So it's not entirely made up, it is about as fictionalized as you can make it while still having a historical basis. Then, of course, there is the question of the one and only, the infamous Romanov curse. Rasputin reportedly told the Tsar that if he was killed by one of the Tsar's relatives, the Tsar and his family would be dead within 2 years. This is often interpreted as having come true, given that Prince Felix Yusupov is typically considered to have killed Rasputin. Felix was indeed related to the Tsar and invited Rasputin to a dinner at the Yusupov Palace, where he attempted to poison him. When Rasputin failed to succumb to the poison, he was shot multiple times before his body was finally dumped in the river. This occurred on Friday the 16th of December 1916 under the old Julian calendar. So the film is correct about Rasputin ending up in a river during the cold Russian winter, but this is the only part of his death that they include. The royal family were indeed dead within 2 years of this. However, it is also possible that the fatal shot was fired by the British agent Oswald Rayner, who was not related to the Tsar. Well, everyone is related to him if you go back far enough. Either way, fulfilled or not, the curse does have a historical precedent, and I actually think that's cool. How many films can claim that their story of a man with magical powers killing off a royal family with a curse is in any way true? It's hard to say how much credit should go to the filmmakers for this, however, because it did kind of fall into that lap. What is quite a dark period in history is also strangely one of the most easily Disneyfied of any true story because it already contains royalty and rumors of magic. One extra thing that is frequently cited as a historical inaccuracy in this film is the uniform this guy is wearing.
I would like to point out that the tiara that Anya wears is a diamond kokoshnik. There were quite a few of these tiaras, but this is probably meant to be the one that belonged to the Dowager Empress. Queen Alexandra, the wife of the British King Edward VII, was her sister and was jealous of her diamond kokoshnik tiara, so she had one made for herself. The queen used to wear it sometimes.
I know Lindsay Ellis's video on Anastasia is old, and I know she said that she isn't proud of the video, but she does stand by the fact that she doesn't like the film. I don't have a problem with that. I like her later videos, and she's allowed to think it's a bad film. She's wrong, but she's allowed to be wrong. However, she also claims that the film is like making a cartoon musical about Anne Frank. I also found a similar statement from someone else arguing that Anastasia is about as historically accurate as a film where Anne Frank moves to America and opens a farm with a man named Mort. Now, where these statements concern historical accuracy, I do not agree with them. Most elements of Anastasia are based on something historical. It's really important in this case to acknowledge that the factual details of the real Anastasia's life are not the only things that deserve to count as history. Anna Anderson and the other Romanov imposters are also part of that history. The film is in many ways based on the history of Anastasia imposters, perhaps more so than Anastasia herself. Although I do think Anya as a character was based on accounts of Anastasia's personality. What I'm ultimately saying is that the writers didn't choose a horrible murder and pull a ridiculous and entirely fabricated narrative with a happy ending out of thin air, which is what the earlier statements sound like they're suggesting. With that being said, I do think that a reasonable discussion can be had about the morality of making a film like this one. The murder. So, in order to continue examining these films, I think it's now necessary to talk about how the Romanovs actually died. There's an awful lot of rumor and misinformation about the murder. It's probably the most debated and confusing thing I will talk about in this video because there is about as much false information being spread about it today as there is fact. I'm going to rely quite heavily on the murderer's reports to piece together an accurate version of events. Most, if not all of them, talked about the murder at some point. The so-called chief executioner, the Commandant Yurovsky's report was written decades after the execution, so it's quite likely that Yurovsky's memory of it had deteriorated. There's also at least one definite and glaring mistake in it, I think it probably is a genuine mistake because I don't think Yurovsky stood to gain anything from lying about this detail. However, the reason I'm inclined to use this account is that Yurovsky was present during the execution, and other than that detail, which I will discuss when we come to it, the account aligns very well with the eventual discovery of the graves, so at least part of it has been proven to be accurate. Eventually, their captivity appeared to take its toll on the entire family. Anastasia wrote a brief description of the Robert Browning poem Evelyn Hope for her English tutor.
Yes, Evelyn, not Evelyn. I will fight you on this.
While I don't want to make any assertions about this, the poem is about the death of a 16-year-old girl, and since Anastasia was 16 when she wrote about it, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that she was expecting to die. Again, we can't know that for certain, it's just something that I expect a lot of people to pick up on. So, the poem is essentially about a 48-year-old man who decides that he is in love with a 16-year-old dead girl he never knew in life. So, he says he will look for her in another life when they've both been reincarnated. Perhaps he will have to search through many lives, but eventually he will find her and they will be together. Good poem, creepy narrator. Anastasia wrote, quote, "There was a man who loved her without having seen her, but knew her very well. And she heard of him also. He could never tell her that he loved her, and now she was dead. But still he thought that when he and she will live their next life, whenever it will be, that then it cuts off and we'll never get to know what she was going to write next, although I think it's quite obvious. This is the description of a murder, so don't expect it to be nice. First of all, we need to establish that it wasn't only the royal family that died that night. Some of their servants went with them to Tobolsk in Siberia during their initial exile, and then to a Patiev house in Ekaterinburg, where they were held for the last weeks of their lives. This is where the murder took place, and the servants who went there with the Romanovs also died with them. These were Ivan Karadanov, Alexei Trupp, Eugene Botkin, and Anna Demidova. Yurovsky claims that on the 16th he allocated 12 revolvers and handguns and a victim for each shooter. There were only 11 victims. Perhaps there was an extra shooter, perhaps even Yurovsky himself. I'm not sure, it's not made clear in his account. They had arranged for a truck to arrive at midnight to take the bodies away after the murder, and at 11 p.m. they began to give out the revolvers. However, the truck arrived at 1 o'clock, and it was only then that Yurovsky began to wake the intended victims. There was something really sickening reading about them having trucks prepared to take away the corpses of people who were, at the time of their arrival, alive. Anyway, Yurovsky claims that they used Eugene Botkin as an intermediary with the Romanovs and their staff, and that Botkin helped to wake them up. He claims they took roughly 40 minutes to wake and dress, and that they were told they were being moved due to unrest in Ekaterinburg. When they were led down to the basement, they took with them items including pillows and a dog. They lined everyone up against the wall, and Alexandra reportedly complained about there not being any chairs.
So chairs were brought in for her and Alexei,
who until then had been carried by the Tsar. Yurovsky claims that he addressed the Tsar, stating that as his relatives in Russia and elsewhere were trying to save them, the Soviet of Workers' Deputies had decided to shoot them all. The Tsar apparently asked what,
looked towards Alexei,
and was immediately shot by Yurovsky. The Tsar is reported to have died instantly. As soon as Yurovsky took the first shot, firing broke out. Some claims suggest that despite having allocated targets, everyone, or at least multiple shooters, went for the Tsar, or that Mikhail Medvedev was the first to actually shoot at him. In any case, the firing was a mess. The victims were screaming, and some of the shooters shot from the doorway. Yurovsky claims that he was almost shot himself and managed to stop the shooting. After this first wave, he claims that most of the victims were still alive. In fact, his account suggests that only the Tsar, Karadanov, Trupp, and Botkin were dead. It's a little unclear at what point Alexandra died.
Alexei was still sitting, but the women were on the floor, which makes a lot of sense. They started to shoot again, and Yurovsky shot Alexei dead.
They tried to shoot the girls in the chest, and a man named Ermakov tried to stab them with bayonets, but they ultimately killed them by shooting them in the head. Another of the murderers, Mikhail Medvedev, who was also known as Kudrin, reportedly claimed that Anna Demidova initially appeared dead, but then moved and began to shout out, "God has saved me," before being shot in the head. I wasn't able to find his original account, but it is reported in The Fate of the Romanovs by Greg Kinn and Penny Wilson. Yurovsky then claims they took apart sledges, covered them in sheets, and used them as stretchers to carry the bodies. He also states that they checked each of them was dead before moving them. They seemed to hope that there wouldn't be much blood because they were trying to shoot them in the chests. This is ridiculous, and obviously there was a lot. At this point, the bodies were to be taken by Mikhail Medvedev and Pyotr Ermakov. Some of the valuables the family had taken with them had been stolen and had to be returned. Yurovsky then collected the valuables and decided to go to the burial. They met a larger group of people near the Verkhovetsky works. These people were surprised that the Romanovs were dead. They then also tried to rob the bodies and potentially do other things as well. The truck also got stuck in a marshy area before reaching the intended burial site. They tried to lighten the load on the truck, but ultimately they had to load up the carts of the people who had joined them. I think this means they moved the bodies to these carts, but I'm not certain. At dawn, they arrived at a gully near the mine where they intended to put the bodies. But there were people there, so they had to change their plan. They went to a village named Koptyaki and cordoned an area off. Yurovsky then ordered men to take the clothes off the bodies and burn them to destroy evidence. It was at this time they discovered jewels, including diamonds, had been sewn into the ladies' bodices. He claims the daughters had bodices made almost entirely of diamonds, which sounds a little excessive to me. This is apparently why they had been so difficult to kill, and it's something that does come up in fictionalized versions. Medvedev's account also claims that Anna Demidova had survived the initial onslaught because of jewels sewn into the pillows she was carrying. He actually calls them greedy for this. They then threw the bodies down the mine where water just about covered them. They thought about blowing up the mine shaft, but at around 2 p.m. they decided to take them somewhere else. They then thought about burning the bodies, and Yurovsky went to get sulfuric acid to disfigure their faces. They had several problems and had to fill in the first grave they dug. They transferred 2 bodies to the truck, but it got stuck again. They burned 2 bodies and buried what remained of them in one grave. This is where we get the glaring error, because Yurovsky claims these were Alexei and Anna Demidova. Alexei was buried in a small grave, but he was buried with one of his sisters, either Maria or Anastasia. It was definitely not Demidova. They then put the sulfuric acid over the remaining bodies and buried them in a separate grave. Yurovsky claims they finished this at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and he told everyone to forget and never speak of it to anyone.
He then claims to have reported to Moscow on the 19th.
Another of the murderers, Ermakov, gave an interview in 1935. However, some of his testimony has been proven to be very unreliable. For example, he claims that the bodies were all completely burned to ashes, which were then thrown down the mine. All of the bodies have since been discovered buried, so this claim at least has been proven unreliable, and it's part of the reason that I favor the use of Yurovsky's testimony. The Secret of Anastasia, 1997. This film was a cash grab designed to capitalize on the Don Bluth film, which came out in the same year. It even gives Anastasia a similar design with bright red hair. However, it's even closer to the 1956 film than the Don Bluth version managed to be. I would say that this is what they actually based the script on, because this version came out just before Bluth's film, and presumably they didn't know exactly what would happen in it. This time, Anastasia has just been left behind in the Imperial Castle in Moscow. It should surprise no one that this is not a real place. The Imperial Castle, not Moscow. Her family were murdered, but nobody ever bothered to search the place, so she's just been hiding out there singing for 10 years or so. Her family has also been cut down in this version. Instead of 3 sisters, she only has Tatiana, who has been renamed to Titania for no reason.
Alexei is in the film, but they show a picture of him doing cartwheels. I bet the real Alexei wished he could do cartwheels.
But given that he had to be carried around by a sailor because of his hemophilia, I doubt he was actually doing much cartwheeling. I'm probably being petty, but this image annoyed me when I watched the film. Anastasia has 4 magical instruments who look suspiciously similar to her dead relatives. So, this version also has magic, but it has nothing to do with the actual rumors of magic surrounding Rasputin. If anything, I think the talking objects are here to make the film resemble Disney's Beauty and the Beast. One day, the Cheka hear their music and they have to flee. Anastasia meets a guy called Vladimir on a train, and he takes her to Copenhagen to meet her grandmother, the Dowager Empress. So many of these films involve her needing to convince the Dowager Empress of her identity, even though Anna Anderson never met her. And it just goes to show how much the 1956 film and the 1997 one influenced the others and the prevailing narrative about Anastasia in the public consciousness. In this case, Anastasia sings a song that her grandmother taught her, and this is what convinces the Dowager Empress. I think this is a pretty good idea. At least she didn't have a coughing fit. Even this film could come up with a better way of convincing the Dowager. Unfortunately for me, Paul also makes a return in this film. Yes, Prince Paul. Given that he never existed, he's probably the most obvious proof that this film copied the 1956 one. Except that in this version, plot twist, he's a communist leading the Cheka. The reveal looks like this. Strangely enough, Paul is probably the most interesting part of this film, because this is where the film differentiates itself from other fictionalized versions so far by daring to broach the subject of Russian politics. I don't want to exaggerate this. The political content of this film is minimal. But by including the Cheka, they actually show some limited interest in Russian history. The Cheka was officially called the,
Всероссийская чрезвычайная комиссия.
or in English, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission, which is equally useless as a title because all I can glean from both is that it's Russian and a commission. They were essentially the Russian secret police from 1917 to 1922 when they dissolved. Of course, this would mean that the film could be set a maximum of 4 years after the murder of the royal family. However, the film is correct in showing that the Cheka were used to eliminate people who posed a political threat to Lenin's regime and Russian communism. I find it really interesting that these are the filmmakers who decided to have a Bolshevik villain. It's something I would have expected more from the 1956 film because it was right after the Korean War and the Second Red Scare was still happening in America, so communism was a real source of fear. Whereas by 1997, Russia had become a little more liberal and the original Cold War was over. I hope you like sequels. However, I can't help wondering whether Paul the Cheka leader was also originally Prince Paul and he's just turned traitor, because otherwise I don't see how he would have been able to infiltrate the Russian emigres. Or perhaps there were just so many displaced Russian royals and aristocrats floating around after the revolution that no one even questioned his claim. Anyway, he kidnaps Anastasia, which is within the Cheka's range. They executed and imprisoned people. Vlad tries to save her and dies. However, because Anastasia loves him, her instruments reveal themselves as her family and sacrifice themselves in return for his life. Vlad is resurrected. The end. If I'm being honest, it's not that bad a film. It's quite cute in its way. I've seen worse, and there are worse films on this list, but it isn't great either. It's less historically accurate than the 1956 film and the Don Bluth film. I would say the only thing it really has over both of them is that some of the other family members get to be major characters. Even if 2 of them are eliminated and the others are changed beyond recognition. They don't get to be good characters, but actually they're probably better off being ignored than being musical instruments. I take it all back. This element of the film is terrible. They're all visually present in Don Bluth's version, even if they don't say much. The Tsar speaks briefly, but they do haunt the film in an effective way, which can't really be said for this method. Imagine dying and being reincarnated as a tuba or a cello. Golden Films Anastasia, 1997. This next film is really interesting from a historical perspective. However, it just isn't very enjoyable to watch. This begins on Anastasia's birthday when the Tsar gives her a Fabergé egg that I thought was intended to serve the same function as the music box from Don Bluth's film, but I'm no longer sure. She blows out the candles on her cake and we get a montage showing just how happy the Romanovs are together, set to an extremely sentimental song. Wanna take this moment in with the ones that I love
Seriously?
The music in this film is so sickly. I know they just wanted something basic and cheap, but it really made me cringe. It turns out that all her presents were Fabergé eggs, but they also contain real talking birds who are just so annoying. This is probably the film where we get to see the most of the rest of the family. They even address the subject of Alexei's hemophilia, which is really interesting. No cartwheels here. We see him taking bed rest, and he even has a wheelchair. However, Anastasia then decides that it's a good idea to take him out in the snow. I thought he was going to get ill, but he didn't, so I don't know why it was in the film. Anastasia smuggles food to the poor and goes to a pub where she meets Rasputin and his dog, who is a Bolshevik for some reason. Wait, Rasputin is a Bolshevik in this? He later shows up at the palace to cure Alexei, and he releases smoke from his hands. His dog is still wearing a Bolshevik hat while this happens, and no one notices. The Tsar gives Anastasia a medal. I wonder if that will be useful later. Rasputin then hands over secret documents about the Tsar's armed forces, and he does this in the palace where Anastasia can see him. They also put his hypnotic eyes into this version, which would be a nice touch, but they do it really badly. We then see the girls helping at a hospital during the First World War. This is something that actually happened in real life, as the extended house of Romanov established ambulance trains, medical warehouses, and temporary hospitals. The Tsarina also established infirmaries where the wounded could be taken on ambulance trains. She oversaw a lot of this personally and undertook medical training courses with Olga and Tatiana. The Tsarina and all of her daughters then helped to take care of the wounded. In this film, this is where Anastasia meets an injured soldier called Alexander Tchaikovsky and instantly falls in love with him. Then Anastasia and perhaps Maria, I'm not sure, hear people calling for a revolution, saying, "People are being repressed, peasants are being shot in the streets, the Tsar must be destroyed." I have a lot to say about this line once I finish the summary. Anyway, the revolution starts. They clear the soldiers out of the hospital, and an angry mob assembles outside the palace.
I don't know about an angry mob, but it's certainly an ugly.
All the while, Rasputin is leading the revolution for some reason. Alexander realizes who Anastasia is. The mob break in, and Rasputin reveals to the Tsar that he is a traitor. Alexander hears that the Tsar has abdicated and goes looking for the royal family. Someone tells him that they have been moved to Ekaterinburg. Then Alexander single-handedly breaks into the house in Ekaterinburg while dressed as a Bolshevik. By this time, I had forgotten that this was a musical because there had only been one song at the beginning. So when a cringy romantic duet started, I was kind of shocked. In a meeting, someone tells Rasputin that because the Tsar's troops are in Germany, the Bolsheviks can just take Moscow. Then Rasputin receives a letter from the British King George V stating that he will send an envoy and attempt to persuade the new government to release the Romanovs because they are cousins. Again, I have a lot to say about this too, and it's so interesting that they included it. The British government did offer asylum to the Russian royal family at one point. However, King George V, who was Nicholas's first cousin, actually retracted the offer because of fears that a revolution might happen in Britain. Personally, this always makes me kind of angry. I can't say whether it would have made any difference, but I do think that Britain should have tried to save them. Bear in mind, we're 32 minutes into this 51-minute film, and the execution still hasn't taken place. This really could have been a different kind of Anastasia film. Well, this letter from George V is what prompts Rasputin to issue an order to have the royal family shot. one of the Bolsheviks blabs to Alexander that the execution will be happening that night. There are wagons outside the building to load the bodies onto, so that's good. I mean, it's accurate. I mean, they were trucks. The Romanovs think they're being moved somewhere else. That night, they direct them into the cellar.
Dmitri.
Why would you choose
Alexander.
While they're going down the stairs, Anastasia realizes that one of the guards is Alexander and walks right back out of the basement. No one even tries to stop her. Then Alexander just doesn't tell her that they're about to be shot down there, and he lets her walk right back down. I couldn't believe what I was watching. Then we hear the gunshots while Alexander cries by the door. The end. There you go, the most historically accurate Anastasia film.
No, okay, but it does fade to black here.
Rasputin sings a song about the Russian Revolution while they march through Russia. Like the Don Bluth film, we get to see them topple a statue of the Tsar.
Now the peasant is the king. Now Rasputin is the king.
Then we cut back to the Bolsheviks loading the bodies onto the wagons. There isn't room on the cart for Anastasia, so Alexander offers to carry her body because he just loves her so much. He cries, then of course it turns out that she's still alive because the medal the Tsar gave her saved her life. But she's lost her memory. Alexander takes her to Romania to his annoying Uncle Boris, who I think was from Odessa? It's here that he asks her to marry him. Then they actually get married and have a child. This part of the film is really, really boring. Then, because Anastasia is asking questions about who she is, Alexander takes her back to find her Fabergé eggs. These jog her memory so that she remembers everything, and the film ends abruptly. Thank goodness. Once the murder happens, everything interesting about the film is over. I think the voice actress was trying to sound like Belle. I actually think they based a lot of this on Disney's Beauty and the Beast. The scenes in the tavern, the bit where they break into the palace using a log. This film contains a lot of real historical information, but it is written in such a way as to be deliberately misleading.
The people are being repressed. Peasants are being shot in the streets. The Tsar must be destroyed.
So, what was this line referring to? The name has been applied to so many events.
This one took place in St. Petersburg in 1905, and the generally accepted version of events is that the soldiers in the Tsar's Imperial Guard opened fire on unarmed protesters marching towards the Winter Palace with the intention of presenting him with a petition. The shootings took place around the city of St. Petersburg. The number of deaths and casualties are unknown, and estimates vary extremely widely, going anywhere from about 100 to several thousand. Some of them were not actually taking part in the march at all. In fact, the number of protesters is unknown and varies similarly. The march was primarily made up of workers who were demanding better working conditions, higher wages, and 8-hour working days. It was comprised of the new Russian working class who until 1861 had largely been serfs. Serfdom is a form of human bondage. Unlike slaves, they couldn't usually be sold between individuals, but they were usually bound to a landowner on whose land they worked. The specifics of serfdom varied between time and place. Sometimes they could hold personal property and wealth, paying taxes to the landowner without the ability to leave, but sometimes they were considered to own absolutely nothing at all. However, in Russia, serfdom became increasingly similar to full slavery. Although the Russian word for slave fell out of use, workers were often mistreated and their requests were subsequently very valid. The Tsar himself has often been blamed for the deaths, and the event is usually considered to be a catalyst for the Revolution of 1905 and the later Russian Revolution. However, some historians have taken a more negative view of the protesters. The organizer of the protest, Gapon, does appear to have been informed that the Tsar would not be at the Winter Palace. He had also been warned that the protest would be considered illegal, but all strikes were technically illegal in Russia at the time, and they happened regularly regardless. A lot of the time their demands might still be met, and there had already been serious suggestions that they should be legalized. Some historians state that Gapon also later admitted that he knew troops would be brought in and that people would be killed. The Tsar was actually at Tsarskoye Selo at the time because multiple attempts had been made on his life, and it was feared that this would constitute another. However, the Tsar chose to leave the Winter Palace the day before the protest, despite some recommendations that he should stay. Witnesses stated that a large number of demonstrators were in fact armed and were looting, breaking windows, and burning vehicles. However, this does not appear to be the majority of them. Some of the workers were singing God Save the Tsar, which was the national anthem at the time, to try to show their loyalty to the Tsar himself, while others were members of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. With that being said, the Socialist Revolutionary Party was vocally against the protest because most of its demands were not political in nature, although it did request some limitations on the powers of officials. The main text I found taking a negative view of the protest claims that Gapon himself had links to the party and had plans in place to seize arms depots should the troops fire on protesters. The writer of this chapter claims that Gapon intended to use the march to show the workers that the Tsar was not their ally. However, it needs to be stated that the Tsar did rule as an autocrat in an absolute monarchy. The official requests contained within the petition were not unreasonable. Working conditions were very poor and the rights of workers were very limited. Most accounts of this event lack balance and objectivity. However, a large part of this defense comes from the book The Romanov Royal Martyrs. It was written by real historians, some of whom have written very respected texts on the Romanovs. However, its title should give you some indication of its agenda. The entire text is very partial towards the family. It really wants to present them as saints who did no wrong. So this version of events does also leave some elements out. For example, it neglects to mention that in 1896, during his coronation, Nicholas described democratization as senseless dreams and vowed to continue as an autocrat. It also neglects to mention that this incident was part of a wider wave of dissent that included workers' strikes during which they elected Soviets or councils to represent them, mutinies at sea, and violent revolts in the border areas. It also fails to mention Nicholas's anti-Semitism. His belief that Jews had been responsible for these events, and his support for anti-Semitic organizations, including the Union of Russian People, which had been established in the wake of these events. He did legalize political parties and allowed a state Duma to be elected in 1906, but he didn't respond well when it refused support for some of his policies. He did also state on multiple occasions that, although he intended to uphold his coronation vow, Alexei as his successor would be free to change how Russia was governed. I am not sure how to pronounce this woman's name. She was a lady-in-waiting and a baroness, and her name was definitely Sophie, but it could be pronounced Buxtehude or Buxtehude. So, she reported that the Tsar told her, quote, "Alexei won't be bound. He'll repeal what's necessary. I'm preparing the way for him." Western European and American fiction have tended to present the abolition of the Russian monarchy and the murder of the royal family as a turning point, at which Russia departed from the path towards political modernity. This is also the case in a lot of traditional Western scholarship, which often argues that prior to the revolution, Russia was moving in a more positive direction that may have eventually resulted in a constitutional monarchy and democracy that would resemble those of Western Europe. Of course, this is entirely speculation, and it's most common in older historiography, for example, that of the 1960s. Robert Service describes this trend as claiming that Russia, quote, took a disastrous lurch onto a path that exaggerated all the exotic and grotesque tendencies that until then it had been steadily eliminating. I find this particularly interesting because it seems to suggest that the monarchy was perceived by these writers and scholars as a reflection of Russia's Western attributes, which are viewed more positively, while the revolution is seen as more inherently Russian and is subsequently aligned with ideas of Eastern exoticism. This also bears some resemblance to the theory that Germany took an abnormal path towards modernity, which contributed to the origins of the Second World War. Unsurprisingly, Russian and Soviet scholarship treated the subjects of the Romanovs and the revolution very differently. In fact, they traditionally claimed that Russian monarchs had been controlled by economic influences which were the true rulers of society. This is heavily based on Marxist ideas of economics. Historiographical debates were centered on whether or not Tsarist Russia had been its own power or under the influence of other countries such as the UK. The Romanovs' reputation did improve in Russia after the dissolution of the USSR in 1991, with some historiography depicting them as victims, although others still take a more negative view of them.
The film does align with the commonly accepted theory among historians that this event was a prominent factor which led to the revolution by massively damaging the Tsar's reputation, particularly among workers and Orthodox peasants who made up a large part of the protest. I could forgive this film if it wasn't for the Bolshevik Rasputin. Dingo Pictures' Anastasia. Remember when I said that there were worse films than The Secret of Anastasia on this list? Well, there aren't worse films than this one. This film looks like it was drawn by children trapped in a basement with nothing but felt-tip pens. It is one of the ugliest animated films ever made, and I say one of only because all the other Dingo Pictures films also look terrible. The thought of watching this film makes me feel physically sick. The voice actors sound like they died just before recording took place. In fact, I find it hard to believe that this was made by real people.
Hello, this is Vincent Price.
Oh, it's Vincent Price. I thought he was dead.
And now I must return to the sweet embrace of the crypt. But I'll be back.
So is he alive or not?
Dingo Pictures was a bit of a mystery in itself, and some people have worked really hard to find out how these films were made and who made them. Well done to them, but I can't stand to look at these things long enough to be even passingly curious about them. They hurt my soul. It is for this reason that I just watched a review of the film. The Golden Films version made me feel like I was wasting my life, and I think this one might have brought me to tears. In this version, Anastasia has bright blonde hair again, but that's where the similarities to Ingrid Bergman end. There's a character in this who looks like Anya from Don Bluth's version, you know, the good one. However, in this film, that character is a man? I hate this film. Rasputin is in it, so I don't even know what to say. 0 stars, the least historically accurate and not remotely entertaining. This film doesn't deserve to exist. Why was Clothes Make the Woman the lost film? I wish I could lose this one. Anastasia Ballet. Yay, we're back to something decent and semi-watchable.
I only saw about half of this version when it was broadcast on television. The first act covers the Romanovs living their normal lives, and then the revolution happens. Because it's a ballet, everything, including the revolution, was quite abstract, but the first act finishes as they are being shot. The second act seemed to be following the amnesia plotline that we know so well. Anastasia is in what appears to be a mental hospital at the beginning of the second act. This aligns with Anna Anderson's stay in a mental hospital, so it would seem that the second act is at least partially inspired by the real-life events surrounding Anna Anderson, while the first is more about the Romanovs and the revolution.
Anastasia, the musical. I love this version. So, the stage musical debuted in 2016 at the Broadhurst Theatre on Broadway. It is based on the Don Bluth film, and just like that film, it had a really good original cast. I'm sure the replacement actors and everyone who has been in other versions was really good too, but I'm most familiar with the original cast. Christy Altamar is a really good Anastasia/Anya. I really like how she plays the character because to me this was a true balance between the very spirited, almost completely unscathed version from the 1997 film and the very damaged version played by Bergman. We essentially get to see her become herself again over the course of the show, and I really like that about it. Also, having watched the Royal Misfits behind the scenes at Anastasia the Musical, Christy seems like a genuinely nice person. I've never met her, but she does seem nice, and I think she's a really good Anastasia. We also had Derek Klena as Dmitri, John Bolton as Vlad, Ramin Karimloo as a new character named Gleb, who we will talk about later, Caroline O'Connor as Lily, who is a slightly altered version of Sophie, and Mary Beth Peel as the Dowager Empress. During the reading in 2012, Angela Lansbury actually read for the Dowager Empress, which I think is really nice. But she was about 90 by the time the Broadway production debuted, so I do understand why she wasn't in it. Mary Beth Beale is also a really good choice, and she has a really nice connection with Christy Altomare. I know that a lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff is scripted jokes, but they look like they were having so much fun working together on the show. The music is also incredible. Flaherty and Aaron's return with most of the music from the animated film, and a lot of new music that blends seamlessly with the old. I love every song in this show. The film already had 2 really beautiful solos for Anya, but thanks to this show, we now have 4 to choose from. The new solos are both so beautiful, and they have this lonely magic to them, a really enchanting wistfulness. Just listen to In My Dreams. In my dreams, shadows call. There's a light at the end of the hall. Then my dreams fade away, but I know it all will come back one day. I know the recording quality is poor. I didn't want to risk a copyright strike for playing the original soundtrack version. I do miss In the Dark of the Night, which was Rasputin's villain song. Rasputin isn't in the show, so the song was cut, although they do reuse some of the melody. However, The Neva Flows, which is a new song for Glab, is a beautiful song, although it's not a conventional villain song like In the Dark of the Night. That's not a complaint, by the way. So the plot largely follows that of the film, but this version begins in 1906 with the Dowager Empress giving the young Anastasia a music box and telling her about the Pont d'Alexandre Troisième Bridge in Paris. Then we fast forward to an older Anastasia dancing with her family, and the Russian Revolution and the murders take place through the medium of dance. We then see the Dowager Empress get the news that they are all dead. After this, we skip forward to 1927 in St. Petersburg, now called Leningrad, where Dmitri and Vlad hatch a plan to find a fake Anastasia and use her to get a reward from the Dowager Empress. A truck backfires and Anya, a street sweeper, gets frightened. A Bolshevik soldier named Glab tries to comfort her. Dmitri buys the music box on the street, which is very similar to how a lot of the Fabergé items were sold off and became lost in real life. Dmitri and Vlad then audition a group of women who are terrible at acting. Then Anya enters Count Yusupov's palace asking for travel papers to get her to Paris. She says she remembers the ballroom. Dmitri laughs at her, but Vlad tells him not to dismiss her too quickly. Vlad asks her who she is, and she explains that she has amnesia but dreams of someone in Paris. We then see Gleb and the other Bolsheviks filing reports on Romanov rumors and imposters. The ladies who auditioned come in and tell on Anya, so Gleb files a report. Dmitri and Vlad then teach Anya how to be royalty. The Bolsheviks arrest Anya, but when Gleb sees that she is the street sweeper from earlier, he just warns her that pretending to be Anastasia is dangerous, and tells her that his father was one of the murderers who killed the royal family. Some drunken criminals try to assault Anya and Dmitri, but Anya fights them off. Dmitri tells her that his father was an anarchist who died in a labor camp. It's nice to know a little bit more about him. He also gives her the music box that he has been unable to open, and she opens it right away. The melody awakens some memory in her, and we see a ball take place around her. The borders are being closed, and trains are being cancelled, and they don't have enough money to get out of Russia. So Anya gives Dmitri a diamond that was found sewn into her undergarments when she was in hospital after being found. This is, of course, a reference to the jewels that the Grand Duchesses reportedly had sewn into their bodices during the murder. Vlad gets exit papers and they leave on the midnight train. I have no idea whether you could take a midnight train out of Russia, and I can't be bothered to try to find out. The train has people the Bolsheviks don't like on it, like intellectuals and aristocrats who are intellectuals, and apparently no one else. We then get a song called Stay I Pray You from the people who are sad to have to leave Russia. This reuses some of the melody from In the Dark of the Night, but it's much slower and more somber. While they're on the train, guards come looking for a count who seem to recognize Anya, and they shoot him dead. I think in an earlier version, perhaps the Hartford, Connecticut one, they were just taking people off the train and shooting them. But in the later version, soldiers board the train to arrest Anya, Dmitri, and Vlad. So they jump off the train and walk the rest of the distance into Poland. The Bolsheviks tell Gleb to track Anya to Paris. They tell him that if she is a fake, he should bring her back as an example, and if she's real, he must shoot her dead and dump her body in the Seine. He feels quite attached to her, but he doesn't want to disobey orders, and he wants to follow his father's example. So the gang make it to Paris. Interval. Woohoo, we're halfway through! In Act 2, they all clean themselves up so they don't look like they haven't brushed their teeth in 10 years. Then they sightsee. Vlad goes to look for his old girlfriend, Lily, who is a lady-in-waiting to the Dowager Empress. Dmitri goes to the hotel, and Anya goes alone to cross the Pont d'Alexandre Troisième. The Dowager Empress and Lily talk about all the annoying fake Anastasias she has to deal with, while hoping that the real one will come along. So she finally accepts that Anastasia is dead, and says she won't see anyone else. All the white Russians of Paris are drowning their sorrows at a place called the Neva Club. This is where Gleb finds out where Anya is and where Vlad finds Lily. They rekindle their romance, and he tells her that he wants Anya and the Dowager Empress to meet at the ballet. Anya has a nightmare about the Romanovs, and Dmitri comforts her. He tells her about when he saw Anastasia in a parade when he was in a crowd of thousands. I just want to note that he is supposed to be about the same age as Maria, but he only had eyes for Anastasia. She was his favorite, apparently. He tells her to imagine being there, and she imagines little Dmitri in the crowd, but then she says that he bowed. He is shocked because he never told her that part. She says, "You didn't have to. I remember." And they both realize that she is the real Anastasia. Then they all go to the ballet, but this time it's Swan Lake. Yay, Tchaikovsky! Next time, I hope it's the Nutcracker because I absolutely love the Nutcracker. But they might have to set it at Christmas for that. They actually interweave their own music with Tchaikovsky's score, and it is absolutely beautiful. So actually, they should probably leave it as Swan Lake. Anya and the Dowager Empress look at each other from across the auditorium. Lily seems convinced when she sees Anya and tries to introduce her to the Dowager Empress, but the Dowager won't see her. Anya gets angry about being used in Dmitri's scheme. In the animated film, she didn't know about the reward, but in this version she did, so I don't really see what she's got to complain about. Dmitri tries to convince the Dowager Empress to give Anya a chance. Then later, while Anya is angry at Dmitri and Vlad, the Dowager Empress arrives to see her. They talk for a while, and eventually Anya says that the last time the Dowager Empress saw Anastasia, she was leaving for Paris and gave her a music box, which she produces and opens. They finally sing their song again together. This implies that they hadn't seen each other for 12 years before the murders, so they can't really have been that close, can they? The Dowager Empress and Anastasia are going to do a press conference. The Dowager reveals to Anya that Dmitri refused the reward and implies that Anya has a decision to make. Then Gleb creeps up behind Anya when she's alone. He says he must take her back to Russia, but when she insists that she is Anastasia and she will not go, he takes out a gun and points it at her. He goes very murderous for a while, but when the moment comes, he can't shoot her. They end up shaking hands, and he wishes her a long life. Anastasia then runs away to find Dmitri as he is leaving, and she kisses him. They leave, and Gleb and the Dowager Empress tell everyone to shut up about Anastasia. The end. It only got mixed reviews, which just goes to show that people have no taste. The only significant complaint I have is that I think the show would have benefited from giving Gleb more to do. In the animated film, we see Rasputin plotting and trying to kill Anya, and he's also able to keep track of her. I do think it's a shame that Gleb is only really important at the beginning and the end. Gleb is listed as Gleb Vaganov, and the father he describes taking part in the murder is
Stepan Vaganov,
who was one of the real murderers. He may actually be the one who ultimately killed the real Anastasia. This is according to Pyotr Ermakov's account, although another participant claimed it was Yurovsky, and others have claimed it was Ermakov.
Yurovsky himself claimed to have killed the Tsar and Alexei, but he doesn't say who ultimately killed the girls.
So Gleb's father, who doesn't appear in the show, is based on a real person, but he didn't actually have any sons named Gleb, so Gleb is a fictional character. However, in the song The Neva Flows, Gleb says that his father, quote, died of shame. He definitely did not die of shame. From what I've read, he really didn't mind killing absolutely anyone. Stepan Vaganov was also killed in 1918 by people who were angry about the brutality he had exerted as part of the Cheka, so not shame. Anastasia, Once Upon a Time, 2020. This is the most recent Anastasia film at the time of recording. That is, until Disney makes one based on the animated film and the musical. This one is live action and sees Rasputin magically transport Anastasia through time to the year 1989. It's about time travel. So again, this makes use of Rasputin's purported magic powers, and that's about it. He isn't a villain in this, he's actually a genuine help to the main character. This really stands out among these films because whenever Rasputin appears in the other films, he is a villain. Partly because of his very extreme appearance and intense eyes, and partly because of his negative reputation for promiscuity and dominating the Tsar and Tsarina. It is very interesting to see him depicted as a genuine friend of the Romanovs. I could have taken out an Amazon Prime free trial to watch this film, but I didn't want to in case I couldn't work out how to cancel it. TV films. These include Anastasia, The Mystery of Anna from 1986. Like Don Bluth's version, it begins with a ball in 1916, then shows the revolution and picks up with the story of Anna Anderson. Like the 1956 version, this leaves Anna's true identity ambiguous.
Apparently it was Christian Bale's first film and he plays Alexei.
It's actually a miniseries, and it might even be the only television version because I couldn't find any others. There was also a 1928 German silent film called Anastasia, the False Tsar's Daughter, which served as an antithesis to most of the films on this list because it accused Anna Anderson of being an imposter. It was based on the claims that she was Franziska Janskowska. I couldn't find this one to watch either. Another German film titled in English as The Story of Anastasia, or Is Anna Anderson Anastasia, came out in 1956, around the same time as the Ingrid Bergman version, and is also loosely based on Anna Anderson's life and claims.
She's also mentioned in the Rolling Stones song Sympathy for the Devil.
There are other films about the Romanovs, but these are all the films I'm currently aware of that focus on Anastasia. I'm surprised no one else has made a film like this about one of the other daughters. I can imagine Tatiana the movie, for example.
I'd also like to give a shout out to some of the other films that aren't centered on Anastasia but do feature the Romanovs, namely The Kingsman. This film is a prequel to the modern-day Kingsman films, and it focuses on Ralph Fiennes as this English gentleman setting up his own secret agency during the First World War. It takes a lot of real historical events and people and warps them into something very sensational and exaggerated. So, for example, the Black Hand Gang, which was the real organization responsible for the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. He was an Austro-Hungarian archduke, and his murder and that of his pregnant wife, Sophie, are often considered to be the spark that launched the First World War. This film takes the Black Hand Gang and Franz Ferdinand's killer, Gavrilo Princip, who was a real member of it, and turns it into a kind of new world order that is conspiring to cause the First World War by getting its claws into the politics of a load of different countries. That's not at all what it was in real life, but I found it very interesting to see how they took something real and made it completely over the top and ridiculous. It's not a complaint, just an observation. They also make Rasputin a member of the organization, which he wasn't in real life. As soon as the main character mentioned having a cousin Felix in Russia, I knew it was going to be Felix Yusupov, and sure enough, they go to visit him in order to kill Rasputin. So, interestingly enough, they included the rumored failed attempt to poison Rasputin, but they decided to explain it by having him figure out that their Bakewell tart has cyanide in it. So he just kind of spews it up. They do make one really annoying and unnecessary error when they claim that Nicholas was a grandchild of Queen Victoria. He wasn't, but his wife Alexandra was. Nicholas was a first cousin of George V, but he was not a first cousin of the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, as the film claims. This is a very common misconception that gets thrown around a lot, so I'm not surprised that it was included, but they should have done better research on that. The Romanovs aren't in the film much, but they do show them being executed near the end. They have them all positioned for a photograph, and then the photographer pulls out a firearm and shoots them all. It's very sensationalized, but it does make use of the possibility that they might have thought that they were going to be photographed. The next film is Nicholas and Alexandra from 1971. This is based on a very well-known biography of the same name by the historian Robert K. Massey. It received 6 Oscar nominations and won 2. I only tuned in near the end of the film when it was on TV, which means that unfortunately I didn't get to see Tom Baker as Rasputin. It has Alexei attempt suicide by sliding down a flight of stairs. I have to assume it was a suicide attempt because he certainly knew he was going to bleed. I've never heard of this actually happening, so I think they made it up for the film. I feel like that's something I would have heard of if it were true. However, I was particularly impressed by the ending. They recreated the basement so well that it was almost scary to see it brought to life like that. It looked exactly like the photo right down to the wallpaper. The film also ends really abruptly. As soon as they're shot, it cuts to the credits on this red background that looks like blood, and I don't know, I think I was expecting some kind of aftermath where we see the bodies being taken out or something, but no. It ends with the Romanovs. It ends where they end. I didn't see much, but all in all, I did like what I saw from this film. Anastasia is also a character in Assassin's Creed, where she looks like this. I didn't know this until I started making this video, and it came as quite a surprise, I won't lie. She's in the comic Assassin's Creed The Fall from 2010, and then in the video game Assassin's Creed Chronicles Russia in 2016. During the murder, she was accidentally bonded with the memories of a Chinese assassin, and this gave her loads of cool abilities like free running and stuff. Another assassin takes her under his wing, and in the end, she leaves Russia and takes on the name. Do I even need to say it? If you've watched the video, you know what name she takes on. This sounds like fun. I don't know, I don't play video games. I'm not sure I can really be bothered to go through any more Anastasia stuff. I kind of love the outfit, though.
The imposters. So, Anna Anderson was the most famous Anastasia claimant, but she was far from the only one. The sheer number of imposters also had an impact on the films. Anna Anderson was probably the most important factor in creating the myth of Anastasia's survival. But the secrecy of the murders, despite how botched they were, meant that as soon as news of them began to spread, so did rumors that one or more of the family had survived. Eugenia Smith was also quite famous as imposters go because she published a book which she claimed was an autobiography detailing how she, as Anastasia, survived the murder. She migrated to the United States in 1922 under the name Eugenia Smitysko. This record also lists her as a Yugoslavian born in 1899. While she was living in Chicago, she started claiming to be Anastasia. In 1963, she moved to New York and published her memoirs. However, she never gained any real support from relatives or acquaintances of the real Anastasia. I skimmed through the so-called autobiography, which she titled Anastasia, the autobiography of HIH, the Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna of Russia. In it, she claims that she immediately lost consciousness during the shooting and eventually awoke unsure of where she was and suspecting that she had been buried alive. Then she claims to have felt a hand touch her forehead and saw the light of a candle and realized that a woman was nursing her back to health. Then various people help her to get out of Russia. A man named Alexander is said to have saved her by offering to help back up the truck that was going to take the bodies away and then climbing into the back when the driver fell asleep. Then they throw the bodies on top of him in the back of the truck without even noticing that he is there. He hears one of the bodies moan and throws 2 of them out of the back of the truck. Then he jumps out of the truck as well and examines the bodies, finding that Anastasia is still alive. The last woman to personally claim to be Anastasia was Natalia Bilikodz. She tried to claim a fortune in the late 1990s. A video of her claiming to have escaped to Georgia was played at a press conference in 2002, but she actually died in the year 2000. DNA tests ruled her out. Nadezhda Vasilyeva was arrested in Siberia by the Bolsheviks in around 1920 and ended up in a hospital. She tried to send letters to George V saying that she was Anastasia. In the end, she died in a mental institution. There was a Russian woman called Eleonora Kruger who just lived in a village and taught languages, and people thought that she was Anastasia. While Anna Anderson made rumors of Anastasia's survival the most prominent, she was not the only Romanov to be impersonated. There was also a story about 2 Russian nuns who were supposed to be Anastasia and Maria. There were even rumors that the entire family had survived and gone into hiding.
Since he was the heir, Alexei also had a lot of imposters.
A woman named Susanna Katerina de Graaff even claimed to be a secret 5th daughter of the Tsar and Tsarina. She claimed that she had been born to them in 1903 and that because they already had 4 daughters and wanted a son, they paid people to adopt her and keep quiet about it. I don't buy this, and I think it just accuses them of being terrible parents. There was also a man who claimed to be the Tsar's nephew, but this was just so that he could go to Hollywood and open a restaurant called Romanov's to serve the rich and famous. This man might deserve a video of his own. The discovery. Forensic reports. For decades, the precise location of the royal family's bodies was unknown, except perhaps to some of their murderers and the people who had helped with the burial. Even some of them claim not to know or remember the precise location, but I can't say whether or not that is true. The absence of bodies as concrete proof is what allowed the legends of survivors, particularly Anastasia, to develop because, particularly before the advent of DNA testing, they couldn't be fully disproved.
Alexander Avdonin,
a geologist and amateur archaeologist from Sverdlovsk, near where the Romanovs were murdered, discovered the location of a burial in 1979. He was assisted by the filmmaker
Gili Ryabov,
who claimed to have been given information by Yurovsky's son, which would lead them to the precise location of the graves. In his account, Yurovsky claims not to know precisely where they buried the bodies,
but since Avdonin did find a grave,
it is quite likely that Yurovsky just didn't want anyone to find them. They were eventually able to open up the grave and retrieve several skulls, which they claimed to have kept for a while before reburying them in the original grave. In 1989, the men discussed their discovery for the first time in interviews. In 1991, the government officially excavated the site. Bones from 9 different people were discovered, and after examination, it was determined that the remains of Alexei and one of the younger 2 Grand Duchesses, either Maria or Anastasia, were missing from the grave. This, of course, refueled speculation that Anastasia and Alexei had survived, and made Anna Anderson's claim seem more plausible because it appeared to be the first solid evidence that there may have been survivors. That is, of course, only if you haven't read Yurovsky's account where he specifically states that 2 people, including Alexei, were buried in a separate grave. In 1994, DNA tests confirmed the identities of the remains. To identify Alexandra and the children, mitochondrial DNA was used, including that of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. Mitochondrial DNA is always passed from mother to child. Prince Philip was a grandchild of Alexandra's sister, Princess Victoria of Hessen by Rhine, on his mother's side. This meant that he had the same mitochondrial DNA as the Tsarina and her children.
Nicholas was identified through a combination of samples. Samples from living relatives along his maternal line with whom he shared mitochondrial DNA revealed one inconsistency, and DNA from Nicholas's brother George had to be used to confirm that he too shared this difference. Male line descendants of Nicholas I provided samples which were used in the genetic identification of both Nicholas II and his children. A later examination also exhumed Nicholas's father in order to extract his DNA.
It was also in the 1990s that DNA comparison ruled out the possibility that Anna Anderson could be Anastasia. Further searches of the area took place in the late 1990s and in 2004. However, it was not until 2007 that another amateur archaeologist discovered the other burial site. This contained 2 sets of very fragmented human remains,
which were identified as belonging to Alexei and the remaining Grand Duchess.
In 2008, it was announced that DNA testing had confirmed these identities. It was finally confirmed that the entire family had been murdered and there were no survivors. Anastasia was officially dead. Identification or the truth. Russian Orthodox Church.
Despite the DNA evidence, which has been confirmed by multiple countries, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia itself, the Russian Orthodox Church still expresses doubt regarding the identities of the remains. Although the remains found in the first grave were given a funeral and interment in 1998, in 2015 the church requested further DNA analysis of the remains of Alexei and the Grand Duchess found in the second grave. These 2 sets of remains were scheduled for internment with the rest of the family on the 18th of October 2015. However, this was postponed, and although further analysis confirmed their authenticity in 2018, it doesn't appear to have been rescheduled. The reason given for this concern was that the family have been canonized as saints by the Russian Orthodox Church, and the remains would therefore be religious relics. So they want to make sure that they're genuine. However, at this stage, I'm not sure that any amount of proof would be enough to convince them. I don't know what evidence further DNA testing could provide that it hasn't already. Unfortunately, from what information I can find, the final 2 sets of remains are still being held in storage, and it remains to be seen when they will be interned with their family.
Continuing fakes, false descendants, reincarnation, and weird theories. So, as it has now been over 100 years since the Romanovs were murdered and their remains have all been located, it should be safe to assume that there won't be any more Romanov imposters. I wish, because then perhaps I could finish this video, but no. Because no one is old enough to be one of the Romanovs, people are now claiming to be their descendants. A Russian man named Anatoly Ivanov claims that his mother was Anastasia,
and that she and Alexei survived the murder.
He has reportedly sent letters to Vladimir Putin demanding that his mother and sister be buried with the Tsar. These letters have apparently gone unanswered. There was also a woman from the Philippines, who I am not going to name because I don't want her to end up being harassed, who claims that Anastasia was her grandmother. Her grandmother was apparently Russian, went by the name of Tasia, and said things that seemed to imply that she was a Romanov, such as that she had to leave Russia or be killed, and that she had siblings named
Alexei and Maria.
There is no way of knowing whether the grandmother actually said these things or not. The woman's main evidence is a photograph of her grandmother, which looks similar to a single photograph of Anastasia. However, I think it is important to acknowledge that this woman never actually claimed to be Anastasia. This is just something her family has started to claim. Perhaps because of the films, and perhaps because of the imposters, the Tsar's children, and particularly Anastasia, have gained a fan base. When I was initially writing this video, it hadn't occurred to me to look up things like fan art, but I stumbled across it when I was looking for photographs, and oh my gosh, there is a lot of it, and some of it gets really weird. I kind of understand people making fan art of the animated film, but it's when you see fan art that is designed to look like the real people or based on real photographs that it starts to get really weird. You get things like people making them in The Sims. It's probably really naive of me, but I was really shocked to stumble across the Wattpad fan fiction. I was not expecting that, but there is a lot of it. I feel like one of my next videos is just going to be me reading these. It is such a weird thing to do. I feel like writing Wattpad fanfiction about real people is always strange, but there are plenty of people who are interested in researching all of them and the circumstances surrounding their deaths. However, some of these fans are so engaged in the mythologized versions of Anastasia and stories of her survival that they simply cannot accept that she died in 1918. This has led to some very strange speculation and discussions of how she could have survived despite the DNA evidence, none of which are remotely true. I have seen people suggest that she could have lost a limb which got buried with the others. there are so many reasons that this is implausible, and the fact that at least fragments were found of all of the skulls makes it impossible. Of course, others doubt the authenticity of the DNA results. Again, there is no reason to doubt them. They have been replicated by multiple countries. Those bones belong to the royal family. Some people still believe that Anna Anderson may have been Anastasia, despite the evidence proving that she wasn't. There are also people who do accept that Anastasia and the entire family died, but speculate that Anastasia may have been reincarnated. The meaning of her name also gets used as justification for this theory. It's just a different type of rising again. I suspect that her interest in evil and hope, with its theme of reincarnation, is also part of why people believe that she herself is reincarnated. You get people saying that they've had dreams about being a Romanov. I mean, this subject matter can give anyone nightmares. I don't want to laugh at the entire concept of reincarnation because what do I know? But there's no way to prove or disprove such claims. I don't really know what to say about this other than that it's a very strange byproduct of the films and mythology we've been looking at that has seen people get so attached to fictionalized versions of a real person that they desperately want them to be real or want to be her themselves.
I guess every lonely girl would hope she's a princess.
They said I was found by the side of a road. There were tracks all around. It had recently snowed. In the darkness and cold, with the wind in the trees, a girl with no name and no memories but these. Rain against a window, sheets upon a bed, terrifying nurses whispering overhead. Call the child, Anya, give the child a hat. I don't know a thing before that. Traveling the back roads, sleeping in the woods, taking what I needed, working when I could, keeping up my courage, foolish as it seemed, at night all alone in my